I'm delighted to be joined by Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris in the studio. Of course, Chris, I need to ask you about the Windsor Framework. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to just quote Richard Littlejohn in the Daily Mail.
Sure.
He said it shouldn't be called the Windsor Framework, it should be called the Barbara Windsor Framework, all front and no knickers. Is this actually just a smoke and mirrors job? Because we haven't heard from Brexiteers that they like it. The DUP are holding their council. You're saying it's this great deal. Why hasn't it got the support of your own party?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, I think it's got quite broad support, and certainly business groups and others in Northern Ireland definitely support it. However, I mean, I used to chair the European Research Group. Like a unionist community and other Eurosceptics, I felt I've been burned a couple of times in the past, and so was determined not to make the mistakes that have been made in the past by bouncing people into things and whatever. So we published everything on Monday, legal text, control paper. We're giving everybody as much space and time as they need to understand that actually this is way more than what Richard Littlejohn described it as. There's treaty changes in here that the European Union has to do. There's massive legal text law, EU law that's essentially being there's a whole host of things in here that actually, as a Eurosceptic, I was always told the ratchet effect of European law only went one way. It's going the other way here. There are lots and lots of principle and indeed practical things in here, but it does take a bit of reading.
But you've got Sir Bill Cash, who, let's face it, is the ultimate veteran Eurosceptic. He's written in the Telegraph today and he's quite sceptical. They've got their star chamber of lawyers looking at it. As you know, all of these documents are open to legal interpretation. What's interesting is the UK's interpretation obviously differs from the EU's. My colleague James Crisp has done this piece this morning about Maros Sefcovic telling his own EU committees, his Brussels committees, oh, well, actually, it doesn't hand back full sovereignty, and oh, no, the Stormont break, it's quite limited. Well, so which is it?
To be fair, the Stormont break is quite limited because it only applies to, because we've got rid of a huge swathe of EU law, it's quite limited to the 3% that remains for Northern Ireland. EU law hasn't actually diverged much from ours at this point in time. We've only left the European Union recently, and there's been a bit of COVID stuff going on in between. But it will in the future, and that's what the Stormont break is for, in that very limited slice of EU law that's left, which gives Northern Ireland businesses access to the European single market. That's why the Stormont break's there. So there is a veto, and it is a veto, if used and goes all the way through the system that of two parties, 30 MLAs triggering this process, then I think when people actually read that and understand that the batch of EU law that's left is just limited to allowing access to businesses to the single market, they'll understand why that's actually quite pragmatic.
But do you agree that the DUP are going to struggle with this idea that they haven't got full sovereignty over Northern Ireland, and therefore if this deal doesn't bring Stormont back together, then what's the point of it? It will have been a failure.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main points of this is to solve the problem for the unionist community. It wasn't just Democratic Unionist Party politicians, it was the unionist community who could not see. If you came across to Great Britain, they saw different goods on the shop shelves and supermarket shelves because people were not moving goods across the Irish Sea because of the protocol of what they saw was in it. You couldn't reduce VAT on solar panels as a government across the whole of the United Kingdom. All those things solved. And future problems that were going to come from the protocol. Parcels, which was going to be subject to full customs in the not too distant future, being able to move your pets around.
OK, but if the Unionists don't support it, and indeed the Brexiteers that you're very close to because of your former status in the ERG, then it's going to be really politically difficult for the Tory party to get it across the line, potentially. I mean, I'm sure it'll pass with Labour support, but I mean, politically, to get it across the line, if you don't have those key caucuses of support. Yeah,
and I'm not in that place to say, oh, yes, everybody's going to be on board, and actually...
Does it matter if the Brexiteers aren't on board?
No, of course. I want everybody to be on board, but I do want everybody because of what's happened in the past. I completely understand the reticence and the wanting to go through the detail, which is why I welcome it. I genuinely welcome it because there is way more in this than I think people initially give it credit for. And as I say, there's some very high-level principle things that we've never been able to achieve before, even when we're members of the European Union. and indeed it guarantees Northern Ireland's place in our union as we move forward.
Can I move on to other matters and talk to you about civil service impartiality? We've had a couple of reports today about Simon Case's involvement in some of the WhatsApp files that the Telegraph have exposed. At one point he talks about lockdown positions being conservative ideology. People have questioned why he used that terminology. Do you still have faith in Simon Case as Cabinet Secretary?
Yeah, I do, actually. I've worked with him quite closely. I was government chief whip under Boris for a period of time, and he's always given me completely independent and professional advice. So, yeah, I absolutely do. OK,
and then do you have faith in the fact that Sue Gray was impartial when she did her Partygate report, now that you know she's going to become Keir Starmer's chief of staff?
So, well, I've worked with Sue Gray in my role as Northern Ireland Secretary, and she's always been completely proper and professional in my dealings with her. Labour politicians in the past have raised lots of questions about civil servants who've immediately moved into positions on the other side of the fence, poacher turned gamekeeper type place, or gamekeeper turned poacher maybe, in the past. So I can understand why it's raised eyebrows. I think the simplest way to solve this situation is for Keir Starmer and his team just to publish all the information, all the messages and stuff they had with Sue Gray at that time, because I think I'd like to think everything would be completely above board.
So you want, full transparency. What would you like to be published?
Well, I think the way to clarify this is for Keir and his team just to publish all the interactions between them and Sue Gray at the time of this questionable time, because I'm quite sure what will come out of that will be there is nothing.
And if it isn't, what if it's revealed that Sue Gray and Keir Starmer and close, and they were in communications during the Partygate inquiry and all that?
Well, I think it will prove the opposite, actually, but I think we do need that clarification.
Generally, are you concerned about the effect on the Conservative Party of these lockdown files? They don't cast Matt Hancock in a particularly good light. You worked under Boris Johnson. He does live up to his reputation, as Dominic Cummings described him, as a shopping trolley. He takes opinions and canvasses opinions. He can't seem to take a decision. He then gets pushed around by the likes of Michael Gove and Matt Hancock. Who was really running the country through the pandemic? Because it doesn't seem it was Boris Johnson.
Yeah, no, I think it was Boris Johnson.
Was it?
But I'm afraid, I'm quite sure it was Boris Johnson. I wasn't in the room at that point in time, so, or actually I wasn't even on the remote Zoom at that point in time.
Well, isn't that a problem, though?
But no,
because the wider cabinet weren't consulted on a lot of this decision making.
No, I don't think that's true, actually. Because
you rubber stamped stuff, but you were given fait accompli.
No, that's not true either. There are cross-cabinet committees that met virtually all the way through this. All decisions were taken properly. All decisions.
Were you in any of them?
I was in a handful of ones involving transport.
But the COVID-O and the COVID other group, what happened was this decision-making shrunk down to basically Hancock, Gove, Rishi, Sunak and Boris Johnson and a few key advisors. The wider cabinet weren't really involved in any of the major decision-making.
So I'm not sure that is true, and that's why you actually probably need the inquiry to demonstrate this, because I did attend some COVID-O meetings when it came to transport, and I did very much articulate a particular view, which was the view of my officials and my judgment on measures at the time.
Did Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out policy spread coronavirus, and does he now have questions to answer? That's what Hancock said. He was his colleague.
What you're seeing, I think, in Matt's messages, as I say, all decisions were taken and recorded by civil servants and taken properly and all that sort of stuff. What you're seeing, I think, is what you've never seen before, and you wouldn't be able to see it for previous pandemics, certainly, is a kind of Matt's thinking at the time, behind the scenes, what is going through his head.
Fighting like sort of snakes in a viper's nest. It's extraordinary, isn't it, for Hancock to be having a go at Sunak for a policy that was meant to help businesses?
Yeah, and I mean, the government at the time...
It's embarrassing, isn't it?
The government at the time was trying to both protect the NHS, protect British people, protect the economy. It was really, and these are unbelievably difficult things at a time.
Why was Hancock trying to undermine the Chancellor?
And remember, on the reports that we've had today, this was pre-vaccine, when testing was limited. It was really generally difficult, and each government,
it's embarrassing, though.
But each government department has its own views, and each minister has its own views, and you come to a collective decision, and when you've taken that collective decision, that is what's delivered, and that is the process of government. Now, what you're seeing is kind of like this. This is the meat before it gets to the sausage making.
But do you recognise some of the, a lot of antagonism has come to the fore here? Do you recognise that was going on at the time? Did you know that? Did you know that you had Hancock briefing against Sunak and all the rest of it?
I didn't, but I'm quite sure
You're shocked by that?
Am I shocked? I know we're all human beings in politics. We all have our own opinions, so I'm not surprised that people have different opinions.
Final quick question, your opinion on tax, because we've got a story in the Telegraph today saying dozens of US firms steer clear of UK following Hunt's tax raid. He's taxing businesses particularly too much, isn't he? And he needs to scrap this corporation tax hike, otherwise businesses won't be investing in Britain. You must be worried about that.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the Chancellor, because I think it's a proper dilemma.
If you were, would you cut the corporation tax hike?
That's a good question. I'd like to see...
Straight answer would be great.
I can't give you it because I don't know the whole situation.
Would you? Well, OK, let's put it this way. Do you agree with corporation tax going up by 6%?
So I agree that I was, I'm very lucky to have been a student of Art Laffer in the time, and I do believe there is a sweet spot where you get more tax in at a decent rate.
We can't be in the Laffer sweet spot if US businesses are ditching Britain in their droves.
I don't believe that's the case either, because, I mean, I know of US businesses investing in Northern Ireland, and that sits on a border with a country that has a corporation tax of 12.
As a Brexiteer, you'd be loving a corporation tax that low, wouldn't you? You must be looking at Ireland, you're there all the time, looking at the Republic, they're getting inward investment, they're making films, they're making TV shows. We're here, we're saying to people who want to invest, oh, we're going to tax you 6% more. It's complete madness, isn't it?
Well, there's also a global corporation tax that's likely to kick in at some point.
But shouldn't we be more competitive against France and Germany? What's the point of Brexit otherwise?
Well, let's see. I think this will work in the future.
Do you think he's going to cut this corporation tax hike?
I've literally no idea.
But would you like him to? Come on, Minister.
Because I don't know the whole picture, it's really difficult to say.
Just a personal preference.
My personal, very, very personal preference. My guts would say yes, but I don't know the whole picture.
Yes to scrap it.
Not
to scrap the hike.
Scrap the hike, to have a competitive corporation tax.
All right. Thank you very much indeed.